an unspoiled paradise on the wild coast, seriously in danger of being mined for titanium. 50/50 has walked this walk. Talking the talk is something the rural Pondo people, whose land it is, are vocal about. An Australian mining company, MRC, their South African division, TEM, and their partners, Zolco, led by David Cunha, have had big plans cooking for Pondo land. This was Jonathan Rand's opinion 5 years ago.
With an issue as controversial as this, it really surprises me that no NGO or capacity building organisation has actually come into this area and said, what are the issues that we're looking at? We're looking at mining, we're looking at the road, we're looking at ecotourism, and said, let's look at the pros and cons of all of them. Let's give you the information that you as a community need so that you can make an informed decision. It seems the debate is happening up here and the people on the ground are actually being alienated, marginalised, and aren't really part of this decision-making process. That's a problem.
Volunteer pilots for the environment, the battlers, have flown journalists and environmentalists over the 22-kilometre Xolobeni mining area for a decade. Today, they fly in solidarity with the communities affected. Nyameni Estuary is the meeting point. Residents walk from their homes along the coast to meet marchers from the north, and it is a vibrant affair with a clear intent. They all oppose mining.
Ngumthanjelwa igama lami apha eMgundlovu kwesikandaba zakhe inkosi nayo inkosi yami ecakwami ukusuka kulamadoda ndowabalayo ndithi mathathu afa.
All those people, the great-grandparents he has mentioned, have all died and they are on this land. He doesn't know if they are talking about mining, how is he going to carry and take up these people who are buried on this land? I've got livestock. I've got kids. I cultivate the soil. I'd rather die than allow this land to be mined.
Land in Pondoland will always be an emotive issue.
He says he's already vivid or very clear that if this mining, the government issues the license, this area there will be war, there will be turbulence, as it was the case during the Pondo Revolt. The purpose of today was to give the local people an opportunity to come out and express their opinion about mining. Because we have had so many people, now we know today for a fact that the local people are opposed. They don't want mining on this land, and we support them.
A landmark judgment was recently handed down in the North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. The right to free, prior and informed consent acquired meaning in respect of how the state regulates the award of mining rights, when the communal land rights of vulnerable and historically disadvantaged rural communities are concerned.
Free means that my clients should not be coerced. They must be free from obligations. And prior means that they should consent prior to the decision being made. And informed means they should have the necessary facts to enable them to exercise their consent.
It is a judgment that echoes Eleanor Roosevelt's prophetic words spoken 70 years ago.
We have a situation where a mining right might be awarded shortly. The mining company will be entitled to come onto the land. The community is implacably opposed, hostile to this. They say they're going to defend their land. There is a real risk of violence and conflict if there are no appropriate measures put in place to deal with the community's concerns about how their lives are going to be impacted by mining.
10 years ago, Ponderland did not show up on the maps of the world. It does now because of the long and sacrificial struggle of the Amadiba coastal residents, who have since 2003 opposed the award of the right to mine heavy minerals buried in their ancestral lands to an Australian mining company. The judgment has massive significance not only for the Amadiba, who brought the matter to court, but for all communal land rights holders in the former homeland areas of the old apartheid South Africa, and indeed in the larger world. How did it happen? 11 years ago, Richard Spoor invited me to join him at a business and human rights conference. And the highlight of that conference was for me to meet Mary Robinson, who has been an enormous inspiration. She quoted this line from Eleanor Roosevelt, which has become a critical focus of my social work intervention.
Remember, she said that if human rights are to matter at all, they must matter in small places close to home, so small that you cannot find them on any maps of the world. The way in which this would be done would be by concerted citizen action, by people holding their governments accountable.
Judgment in case number 73768 of 2016, Xolobeni and others versus the Minister of Mineral Resources and others.
In the event the following order is made. 1. It is declared that the first respondent lacks any lawful authority to grant a mining right to the fifth respondent in terms of Section 23, where it's Section 22 of the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, unless the first, sixth and seventh respondents have complied with the provisions of the Interim Protection of Informal Rights to Land Act 31 of 1996. 2. It is declared that in terms of the Interim Protection of Informal Land Act 31 of 1996, the first respondent is obliged to obtain the full and informed consent of the applicant and the intended legal community as holder of rights in land prior to granting any mining right to the fifth respondent in terms of Section 23, where it's Section 22 of the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002. 3. The cost of this application are to be paid jointly and separately by the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth respondent.
That's a good deal.
And so the first order says consent must be granted before the mining right is even awarded. And without consent, the minister is prohibited from granting the award. Victory is bigger. It's not just for the Xolobeni community. It means communities that are under customary law have a right to say no before mining rights are granted. But the order then takes a step further. And the order then goes on to say that the minister is required to get the full and informed consent of the Ngungundlovu community before granting a mining right. And then lastly, the minister and the company must pay your legal costs.
Johan Lorenzen, you must feel a very happy man for all the hard work you put into this judgment and getting this result. I know you and Richard were kind of having a bet with each other as to whether the judge would go quite so far as the right to say no, or whether she would stop short with that and at least give you what Richard's argument was, the right to kind of proper compensation. So it looks like you've got the bottle of whiskey. Have you?
Appeal pending.
Before we get into it, I just have to say, from my point of view, I found it rather amusing that we could have almost anticipated that she would give the free, prior and informed consent, because even the Zolco and Tim implied that they thought that was necessary. But the only way they got it was to forge 3,000 names of people claiming that they had as well.
Of course, I don't know whether the list was forged or not. That's sort of,
Lawyers love to argue, but let's not argue over that, because we actually are both very happy because of what's happened. So let's get back to the judgment. But I know you like to, make your points in Twitter, and you gave a very nice summation of things. Just can you take us through the 8 or 9 points that you made in your Twitter feed?
Well, I think the context is important in that this is a response to lawyers representing mining companies saying that this is somehow radical and somehow bad for investment. Interesting, because I think they probably now get a hell of a lot more work if they now need to help companies comply with what FPIC entails. Sort of a few points that they made. One relates to lack of certainty. And I thought that's a particularly thin point, because there has been this intense lack of certainty around what engagement with communities is required, and different companies that take different approaches, and that provides a race to the bottom, because the company that works most cheaply with communities is then going to have the highest profit margins. There's now certainty in terms of what's required. This judgment, provided it's either not appealed or it holds up on appeal, says you need to get full and informed consent before your mining right is granted. That's it. Certain. Boom, bang. And that's I think useful. So I think to say this should be seen in the context of policy uncertainty is unfortunate and in fact incorrect.
Yeah, it's nonsense, because have we heard from what they call themselves now, Minerals Council South Africa yet? Have they responded? And the industry as such to this judgment, have you heard anything yet?
I've not seen anything. I don't know if you have, John.
I haven't, but what I do can infer is that Michael Tuleke and Roger Baxter always said about their priority is the social license to operate.
Sure.
I mean, this is just another way of saying prior, free and informed consent is about the social license to operate.
It sets the template of what that license looks like.
Exactly. So, at least in law, IPILRA and MPRDA are now properly related to each other. Because that seems to be the major import of the judgment, is IPILRA. So to explain that to us lay people, we don't understand what those two pieces of legislation are.
So the Interim Protection of Informal Rights to Land Act was passed because it had to be by Parliament. Section 25(6) of the Constitution requires legislation to be passed to give effect to the right to tenure security for people who have insecure tenure because of our disastrous history. And so IPILRA is that, and what it says is where you inter alia, where you hold land under customary law, consent is required before any deprivation can occur. So that's a starting point. And I think within the plain text language, couldn't be clearer. Consent is required prior to a deprivation. So then the interplay then goes over to the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act, MPRDA, which when changed the existing law to say that when a mining right is granted, that is automatically a limited real right, a right in the property over which the mining right is granted. And what that did is something important, which is to say, if you are a common law rights holder, which is in this country predominantly white people and corporations, you do not have a right to prevent mining from occurring. You only have a right to compensation. And so that then removed people who had already benefited from apartheid from the ability to then essentially rent seek on that and have a sort of further apartheid dividend by being able to extort mining companies, which the policymakers thought it's in our interest to have mining. So the right to say no for white landowners is taken away. And then the question is, how does that fit in with the pillar, with the Interim Protection of Informal Rights of Land Act? What always seemed fairly straightforward to me is granting a limited real right, which is a property right enforceable against the whole world, over a piece of land must be a deprivation of the land rights. And if it's a deprivation, consent is required. And so that seemed like a fairly straightforward argument, and Justice Basson has accepted it on the plain text and also with reference to the purpose of both statutes, which is to advance transformation and empowerment of historically disadvantaged persons within the context of international law, which is increasingly embedding free, prior, and informed consent as a standard where indigenous people's rights are affected.
Now, what worries me, there are two words in those two pieces of legislation, one each, that worry me. Let's start with the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act. This presumption that you develop the resource and the assumption is that people will develop with it. Now, it seems to me that what this judgment's done is said, hang on, the community have a right to say no, because it doesn't mean ipso facto, just because you're developing a mine, the people are developed, and they're not coterminous. Say a little bit about that, because that has been why the Amadiba would say no, because they really don't see a developmental benefit to them. And as has yet to find any community that's been resettled in these drastic ways has ever found it to be developmental. So that's obviously my social worker kind of size coming and saying...
No, absolutely. So I think that's a really vital point. The right to say no being stripped away from general landowners coincided with a boom in mining, particularly on customary law rights. It said in the Business Day article by Alan Reid that 90% of the new mining rights applications are over customary title. So while MPRDA was meant to have a transformative effect vis-a-vis white land owners, in fact what happened is wide-scale devastation and dispossession of black people in South Africa. And so that has been, and because the situation has essentially been, you're entitled to start mining. You'd rather not bring an eviction application, so you start mining in the grazing fields and in more remote areas, and you increasingly move your mind through the plowing fields and make life so intolerable that community members are forced to accept a pittance of the compensation that they would be entitled to. And so that approach and the policy uncertainty that comes with that, that different companies, the only check is how responsible you feel like being on any given day, not the law and not the enforcement agency. That has been devastating for communities and has been what's prevented this co-development that one would aspire to the extent there is responsible mining, responsible mining.
And of course, and also the question is, it's customary law and traditional leadership. The problem is we like to interpret customary law as being the possession of the chiefs and the kings. Now, in the Bondo case, well, we've seen what's happened with both the king, who was then deposed, and the chief, who was then co-opted. So hopefully it's a new dawn from the point of view saying, no, customary law doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the people. And now, and what we have seen unfolding, well, I've observed it over the 12 years I've been involved, is a kind of a resilience of people understanding the connection to the land. And I would hope that people would see the deeper lessons to be learned by that.
That customary law in its nature is generally, and not always, democratic and accountable. And that did not suit colonial leaders and did not suit apartheid leaders. And so it was distorted to resemble what was believed to be how monarchies should work at the time, which is a despot at the top who makes decisions, and governance was through To use Mamdani's words, people were governed through decentralized despotism. Kings, chiefs, headmen were given wide sweeping powers to make decisions on behalf of people, whereas the customary role had generally been not to make decisions, but to affirm when consensus had been reached. And so that obviously has significant negative impacts on communities and their ability to make decisions that they have agency in. And so while he had hoped for a break from that post-1994, it certainly feels that the current government has doubled down in some ways. When I speak to mining companies, they sometimes even complain to us to say we would love to speak directly to people, but the Department of Mineral Resources says we must and we may only deal with traditional leadership. So that's a deeply problematic issue. So getting the Interim Protection of Informal Rights of Land Act gives effect to democratic and accountable customary law.
But then the question getting to the interim protection of rural land rights, interim. But it's 20 years. How long? When was it passed?
It was passed in 1996. It never lasts for more than 12 months. It must be extended in the Gazette. But remember, it's constitutionally mandated. Parliament cannot just fold its hands, let a pillar die, and say, what can we do? And we're quite confident, to the extent the Minister of Rural Development, who's responsible, allows a pillar to fade into oblivion, it would be fairly straightforward to bring a legal challenge to address that.
Where do we go from here? What do you think?
Oh, they have 20 days to appeal, 20 court days. So we sort of hold our breath for now. Our clients have been putting significant pressure on the state to say, respect our rights, affirm the right to say no, and let's move on from here. Whether that, and that message seems to have been endorsed by Cabinet, but whether that gets through to Minister Mantashe is a question we'll have answered 20 days. Of course, it's December, so the holidays mess that up. It will be late December when we find out.
Yeah, well, that gives us a bit of time to lobby. There is the last question for you. Well, the point is really a political one, because I know this mining company better than they know themselves. I mean, you were just recently...
How much do you owe them, John?
They're closing
5.5 million.
That's right. But I was amused with your latest tweet where you found that you were trying to do some research on who their auditors were. And then you found you got hold of the person that's listed at Cipro, and he's never heard of them. Now, is that right? Just explain that.
Yeah, so the Xolobeni Empowerment Company is supposed to be the vehicle through which the Xolobeni community is supposed to benefit. And in fact, there's a purported divestment by Australian MRC that would move their shares to Keisha Investments, which is supposedly wholly owned by Xolobeni, though it's issued preference shares to other people. That's the starting premise. So we've always been curious, well, who are the real shareholders? And Section 26 of the Companies Act says we're entitled to know who shareholders are, but it has a quite cumbersome remedy, which is that you must ask the company. And companies are hard to find. Our registered letters have gone unanswered to the official registered address of the company. So I found their auditor's details as listed on the CIPC, and wrote to the auditor to say, we've made this request, please answer it. The auditor said he's never heard of the company. This is the registered mandatory auditor. So it tells you something. I won't speculate what it tells you just yet, but we're going to unpack that saga. And over the next 12 months, I hope to have, if we speak next year this time, we're going to have a much clearer picture of who the shareholders are or are not.
Because what it reminded me of is that when they first got their mining rights application up, they used MWeb as their service provider. And they actually had a web page on MWeb, and they had an account with them, so they basically were their server. And they actually published stuff on that which was outrageously defamatory towards me and others. And I remember inquiring about this, and MWeb shut them down. MWeb refused to kind of continue to host them.
This is Xolobeni Empowerment Company.
In Transworld Energy and Minerals.
Thames website.
The holding company. And I discovered this because when Andrew Lashbrook took over after the first mining rights were revoked in 2011, he had another shot at it. And you know, the emails that and everything that I'd been using for him weren't getting through. And he then did some research and found that he had inherited a situation where there was a complete mess. It looked like a fly-by-night operation. Got reputable EIA consultants who, I'm told, wouldn't do any more business with them either. So the question comes back, and I'm not just sitting here to gloat. I mean, why are these guys suing me? But I mean, it's not about that. It's saying, why is Gwen Montashe seemingly going so far out on the limb for them? And my experience from 12 years of working here has seen is that in many respects this thing prefigured what we saw coming later. It's not just about mining law and administrative law, it's about something more deep and sinister.